So today we're going to continue our conversation about price. So we talked last class about price. Who could give us a little bit of a quick recap from last class? Who could tell us what we talked about? What are some of the key takeaways? We talked about pricing objectives.
Yeah.
What did we say the pricing objectives were?
Profit is one of them.
Profit is one. Sales is another. Market share is another pricing objective.
Unit share?
The unit volume. Anything else? What about social responsibility? Is also a potential pricing objective. And we talked about price elasticity of demand. We said some markets are elastic, some are inelastic. And today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about different approaches to pricing, demand-oriented approaches to pricing. So one example of a demand-oriented pricing approach is skimming.
What is?
Skimming means that we start at a high price and then lower the price of our product or service in a planned way over time. It's not a reaction to the introduction of a product by competitors or the competitors increasing their advertising. It's a deliberate strategy. It's a demand-oriented strategy, which is referred to as skimming, which is very common, for example, in technology markets. So, for example, in electronics, skimming is very often used by companies. So a good example would be the VCR. Do you guys know what VCRs are?
Yes. Yeah.
You do? Really?
It's like a tape of movies.
So over time, so electronics manufacturers, whether it's Magnavox or Sony, they tried to manage the adoption curve model. They tried to manage the adoption curve process. And that's why skimming is something that we're interested in terms of a demand-oriented pricing approach, because it's going to impact the rate at which demand for a particular product or service is going to occur. And even more so in elastic markets, in markets that are price sensitive. So what that means is that when you lower the price of the VCR over time, whether it's every 3 months, every 6 months, whatever schedule we set, our expectation is that as the price declines, that more people are going to purchase the product. And the first VCR that I purchased at Macy's.
Wow.
And the first VCR I purchased, I paid over $1,100 for a VCR. Now, you could buy them
$11.
for $39 in CVS, Walgreens, Kmart, Target. You could buy a VCR for very little money. The manufacturers lowered the price over time because they wanted to increase the number of people that purchased the VCR. So those who were willing to pay $1,100 or more for the VCR, those we identified as innovators, which is approximately 3% of the market. The model says 2.5%, but it could be 3%, it could be 4%, it could be 5%. The idea is that a very small percentage of the target market are going to be the first to buy and are willing to pay a high price. But then our challenge, remember when we talked about the adoption curve model, which is also referred to as the diffusion of innovation model by Everett Rogers. Everett Rogers created this model, and it's a bell-shaped curve that says that when the product is first introduced, in the introduction stage, there's a small percentage that are willing to buy the product at a very high price. Those are the innovators. But then the question is, well, now that they've purchased the product, how do we get them to either purchase another product, or how do we get the other 98% of the market to purchase the product? And we said that in elastic markets, that means that one of the levers, one of the things that we could do to increase the rate of adoption, to get more people to purchase, is lower the price. Now that's not the only thing, but today we're talking about price. Last time we talked about price as well. So one of the things you could do is lower the price. Of course, you could advertise more. It's also going to help increase the rate of adoption. You could add more features. So there's other things that you could do that is going to increase the rate of adoption. But for our discussion today, we're focusing on price. So they lowered the price, and then the early adopters purchased the product. And then they lowered the price again, and then again, and then again. Now, in an elastic market, this is going to be very effective. In a market that's price sensitive. Not all markets are price sensitive, which means that if you lower the price or increase the price, the demand is not going to change. So think about, for example, medication. Let's say, for example, heart medication. If the price goes down, so what do? Instead of taking 1 pill a day, you take 2 pills a day? Right? The demand is not going to increase, is it? So before you were taking 1 pill a day. Now, because they lowered the price 20%, so now you take 2. No, that would be elastic. It's not price sensitive. Or if they raise the price, what if instead of lowering the price 20%, they increase the price 20%? That's it. I'm not taking heart medication. That's ridiculous. You're still going to take your medication even though the price has gone up. Now, there may be some substitutes. Maybe you might ask the doctor to write a different prescription, a different brand that provides the same functionality but might be less expensive. But in general, I think it's reasonable to say that what I've described is an inelastic market, a market that's not price sensitive. In other words, the price of medication. Now, in some cases, some people, they just can't afford it. So there may be some people who say, you know what, I just can't afford to pay that much for medication. And that's unfortunate. We'd like to think that somehow people are just, they have the money and they'll be able to afford their medication. And their consumption wouldn't decrease. So companies also have patient assistance programs where if you can't afford the medication, they'll give you the medication at a reduced price, in some cases even free. So skimming, we start at a high price and then lower the price over time. So remember, we're thinking about two models and overlapping them. We're thinking about the diffusion of innovation and the product life cycle. So at the time of introduction, what we're saying is that in electronics, it's common to use a skimming pricing strategy. So when we introduce the product, we introduce it at a high price, and then how do we get from introduction to growth? How do we sell more units? Well, we lower the price. And how do we continue to grow? Well, in this case, we'd lower the price again. and then again and again. So the models, these two models are related. So they're very relevant. Two really insightful models, the product life cycle and the diffusion of innovation. They're very insightful, and importantly, what's the key takeaway? Is that we can influence those models. So the product life cycle includes several stages: introduction, growth, maturity. Maturity is the point at which sales are flat, so growth is no longer occurring. Then decline, and then in some cases obsolescence, which means if the product has become obsolete, then sales are zero. Or maybe even when it's close to zero, we might even consider the product to be obsolete. So why is it important for us to understand that? Because what it says is, that model suggests that if we do nothing, that's what's going to happen. So there's a cost of doing nothing. And the length of time, the period, the amount of time for the growth is going to vary from product to product. So it's not like you could say, well, for how long are we going to be in the growth stage of the product life cycle? You can't say it's going to be a month or a year or 5 years or 10 years. It depends on the product, the category. Some products could be in maturity for a very long time. That's not necessarily a bad thing. When you think about market attractiveness, when we go through our portfolio analysis, to say that the category is large, and whether we have a small share of the market or a large share of the market is going to influence our future decisions in terms of how we manage the organization. Does it make sense? So maturity is not necessarily a negative. It just means that the category isn't growing. But if we have 30% of the market, we have a significant business is large, hopefully it's profitable. The BCG model looks at what? What are the two dimensions that we look at in the Boston Consulting Group model? So the growth of the industry and the market share. So that's why I'm mentioning maturity, because that would mean that growth is low or virtually non-existent. Because it doesn't mean when we say that a category is mature that there's not any growth. So like, for example, the beverage industry. Beverage industry in the United States is about $200 billion per year at retail. And it grows approximately 2 to 3% per year. That's not what we mean by growth. When we talk about growth, we're talking about growth that's significant. So 30%, 50%, some markets, some technology markets or categories are growing at 100%, 200%, 300% per year. So 3%, you could say, no, but it's growing. But that's not the kind of growth that we're thinking of. It's only growing 2%, 3% per year, then that's an indication that the category is mature. And certainly if it's less than that, then there shouldn't be any doubt. So what we need to understand is, how do we use price to manage the product life cycle? How do we use price to influence the rate of adoption? That's critical for us to understand. So remember, when you look at that model, we don't just accept that. What we're trying to do is, as marketers and business people, is to extend the period of time that the product experiences growth and accelerate the rate of adoption.
Isn't that why they introduced that at such a high level, to make up for later on possible losses? Like, as part of strategy or some kind of planning in the beginning, like, forgot what mechanics called.
Yeah, so that when you should be able to lower the price and still be profitable.
Yeah.
Because over time, you're going to achieve economies of scale.
And that high price will cover whatever losses you might want, or cover salaries or machine or use or things like that.
Yeah, and offset startup costs.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we introduced the price, we introduced the product at a price that's high, and then lower that over time. That's known as skimming. What would be a good example? So we talked about the VCR, which is certainly a great example of skimming. They introduced the VCR at a high price and then lowered it over time.
Video game systems.
All right, so tell us about the video gaming.
So I know, like, I don't remember how much. Like, I remember a PS3 like started at like $500 or $600. Now it's like, I don't know, $300. I think. I have no idea, but like they always come out with a higher price, especially because there's new like technology factors. So let's say a new system comes out, that could reduce the price, but just over time, once people have it, they want to try to get new users, so they lower the price.
Right, they want to get new users. They want to get increase the rate of adoption.
What about clothing in general? Like, uses a lot that, like.
So some retailers use what we call a high-low strategy, which means that they're on sale like 80% of the time. So they're constantly running sales. So remember we talked about channels of distribution? That's very common in department store channel, where the product is set, like you're saying, like clothing, at a high price, but it's always on promotion. They're always having sales 20% off, 30% off, 50% off. That's what you're talking about is a retail strategy. That's something that retailers use. What I'm talking about here is a skimming strategy used by the manufacturer of the product. Some retailers use a strategy known as EDLP, which is everyday low price, like Walmart. Walmart's strategy is EDLP, which is that they don't run sales usually. They don't heavily promote their products in terms of selling the product at a reduced price. Their positioning, if you will, their pricing strategy is such that they want us to believe that their products are on sale all the time, so to speak, that it's the everyday low price, that their prices are always low, so they don't run sales.
What about software? Like, it's very expensive in the beginning, but once something new comes out, something like that, it loses its price completely.
Well, we have to understand who is it that is implementing the strategy. Like, for example, the Xbox, right? In the Heights, there's when that was first introduced, the Xbox 360. Students were telling me that, well, they're selling it down the street for $750.
So high.
So the question is, but who is that? A Microsoft strategy? Is that who's getting the margin there? Is it Microsoft or is it the retailer?
No, it's like clothing already, yeah. But
You see the
with
difference?
Software, it's not like that, is it?
Well, so give us an example.
So for example, Illustrator, right? Like the whole package of
Right. So for example, Adobe Creative Suite. So they have Creative Suite 2, 3, 4. So does Adobe sell the prior version at a lower price, or is that something that the retailer
no, the
implements?
With time, the first version, if you buy from the Adobe itself for cheaper once the new versions come out. So is it skimming also? Because first right now, the last version right now costs like almost 2,000 or something like that. So it's like, but the previous one also cost like that, but now it's like 400. So
Right.
it seems like it's skimming.
Right. So what do you think about that? What's happening there? Is that an example of skimming, or is it a different product? Are we just selling different products at different price points. So basically, is it a line extension? So we had a product that was at $2,000. Now we replaced that and we're selling a different product. Of course, it's the Adobe Creative Suite, but different features now. We're selling that at $2,000, the CS5, Creative Suite 5, and then the one, like you're saying, Creative Suite 4, Creative Suite 3, is at different price points. So is it a line extension? Are we extending from CS2, extending now to CS3, to CS4, to CS5? So are we actually lowering the price, or are we actually increasing the price? What do you think?
I mean, like, if it's line, then yes, we're increasing the price if we're looking at it as a line extension. But in terms of service, like VCR, for example, like, right, it's outdated by like DVDs, right? So like, I mean, in terms of service, it's the same thing. Now this software is outdated by newer software, except that it's a one owner, and there it's like two different completely technologies. So if that's the definition, then I guess that was the line extension, and this one would be the skimming.
Yeah, so it depends on how you're going to define the product.
Right. If we define in terms of services, then they both can be skimming.
In terms of services, like
what kind of service they do, like that they both have,
yeah, the different
outdated,
features.
Yeah.
Right. So what do you think about that, where a product becomes obsolete? You replace it with, now is that an example of incremental sales or cannibalization? Remember we talked about that? We talked about incrementality versus cannibalization.
Yeah.
So what is that, what Alexei is sharing with us? Are we having incremental sales when we introduce Creative Suite 2, Creative Suite 3, Creative Suite 4? What do you think? Probably not.
We're cannibalizing that product.
Yeah, we're cannibalizing the sales of the prior version.
And that continues innovation.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
It's the same
Yeah.
good thing.
Yeah, so it's. I think it's a good thing. It's an example of continuous innovation, and we'd like to think that that's going to result in some incremental sale, but most of the sales we're replacing. We're cannibalizing our old sales.
If you make the old one cheaper, then you're cannibalizing from your new sales, right? Because then people are going to say, I may as well buy the old one for a cheaper price.
Right, and that's what we're seeing also, what we saw with the iPhone. What happened when they introduced the iPhone? So very shortly after it was introduced, like within a month or so, when the iPhone came out, it was $600, and then only several weeks later, like maybe 6 weeks later, they lowered it. They lowered the price to what? $400. And what do you think about that situation? Is that an example of
Skimming, yeah.
Skimming.
For sure.
Yeah.
right? So the product is the same, right? So I think that's what we're. The reason I mention that, see, is what I'm trying to clarify. What your point is it the same product, or is it a different product that that we're selling in the marketplace? See, in that case, it was basically the same product, but they understood that as it approached the holiday season, they knew that they weren't reaching their target, and also, so there's things that happen behind the scenes at Apple that we're not privy to. So there's a number, we have to make some assumptions. One is that they weren't going to achieve their unit volume sales, and so they lowered the price. The other thing that could have happened is that because there was a delay in the launch, that they had already decided, like we were suggesting, that they were going to lower the price at that particular point for the holiday season. But because of the delayed launch, it turned out that it was a change in price within 4 to 6 weeks after they had introduced the product. Originally, that's not what they had expected. They would have introduced the product when they had originally planned. Then there would have been enough of a cushion, if you will, between the time that it was introduced and the time that they lowered the price. But certainly, I think that's a good example also of skimming, where they introduced the product at a high price and then lowered the price of the iPhone, and then how much is the iPhone selling for now? With a contract,
model,
You can get one.
Yeah.
the first model, probably
200, right?
probably can get cheaper.
200 and 16.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
but it's 16 gig.
That's because the phone company takes some of the, like, they bill papers on it, so it's not really that price.
Right, absolutely. That's an excellent point, Zach. You see, what's happening is that the service provider wants to get us to purchase their wireless communication service. So what they're willing to do is,
Subsidize.
yeah, they're subsidizing the cost of the product. In some cases, you could get phones or any number of phones for free even. But this phone is obviously so expensive that they incur part of the cost and the customer pays part of the cost. And they do that as an incentive to get you to take the service. So the price at the Apple store is different than the price at, let's say, like at AT&T. If you go in there to buy a store, because if you go in there to buy a phone in their store, because what they want to do is have you sign a 2-year contract. If you sign a 2-year service contract, then they'll give you the phone at a very reduced price. But there's other strategies. The company has a decision to make as to whether or not they're going to use a skimming strategy, or maybe they might use what we call a penetration pricing demand-oriented approach, which is that you introduce the product at a low price. So you introduce the product at a low price, so right out of the gate, you're trying to sell as many units as possible, as quickly as possible. But sometimes where students are a little unclear is they try to draw an analogy between skimming and penetration. And they write on exams, skimming is you introduce at a high price and then lower the price. And then they say penetration pricing is just the opposite. You introduce at a low price and then increase it over time. No. In fact, in many cases, it's like almost impossible to do that. To introduce it at a low price, and then you tell them, what, just kidding, now it's double. It's very difficult to raise the price after you've already established a price point in the market. And that's why promotions, when we try to promote products, and let's say, like for orange juice, it's very common that orange juice is promoted at 2 half-gallons for $5. So 2 for $5. But a half a gallon of Tropicana orange juice is not $2.50. But people expect, because it's promoted so heavily at that price, that really that becomes the price in people's mind. And so very often people are reluctant to buy it at the regular price, which is basically $4 for a half gallon. And what do they do when it's on sale? So they buy more. So let's say if they usually consume half a gallon of orange juice a week, when it's on sale, they buy 3 half gallons. And then what does that mean next week? They don't buy any. And the week after that, they don't buy any. So we need to keep that in mind, the impact that promotions are going to have on our sales in the short term. So what that's described as is overstocking the customer or overstocking the trade, because retailers, they also buy ahead. If the manufacturer offers a promotion, sure, they're gonna order 10 extra container loads. Not that they're going to sell it that week, but that they're going to sell in the next week or the week after that. Ideally, perishability is not an issue. It could be, then they have to adjust their approach, but they might also buy ahead. So penetration pricing is we introduce the product at a low price.
Just in general.
Right, period. It's no like then you increase the price. I don't know, that's very challenging to do that. You see why?
Yeah.
But What would be an example of somebody doing that? Like, is anyone ever? Like, in what case would you ever?
Are you
do
saying raise it after
Yeah.
the?
Just like why would you
I was
even do
thinking.
that? in the
I was
first
thinking, has anybody ever released a new product and said like, the price of this product is going to be $500, but if you buy it in the first 2 weeks, it's only $300?
Yeah, you could do that. What we do is very often to manage channels. What we do is we introduce a product. Yeah, it's unusual to do that because people are not going to want to pay a high price once they've already purchased a product at a low price. They're not going to want to pay a higher price anymore. We've already established the perceived value in the market. So the thing is, we need to keep in mind though is that the number of units that we're going to sell, if we implement a penetration pricing strategy, is going to be very significant. So we're trying to sell a lot of units in a very short period of time at a very low price. So that creates a challenge for us. The challenge is we have to have the production capability. So if we sell the product at $1,100, then let's say we have a demand for 10 million. But if instead of at $1,100, we're selling the product for $39, now we have an annual demand of 250 million. So we have to ask ourselves, and this is also something that we consider when we deploy a skimming approach to pricing, are we going to be able to meet demand? So if we introduce the product at $39, are we going to be able to produce 250 million units to meet demand? Now, that's a problem because the assumption is that we are going to have that demand. In other words, we're making an assumption that people are going to buy it at $39. So we're going to build capacity to produce 250 million units. But are we managing our risk effectively? Because what happens if they don't come? What happens if we built capacity to produce 250 million of this product and the competitor introduces a product that leapfrogs us at the same time? So in other words, they have an advanced technology, technology that's more sophisticated than our product. Now we have the ability, you've got a big problem. So we have to think about that because we have to be able to produce the amount of units that are going to be demanded, and that means that we have to create the production capability, which means we might be investing billions of dollars in manufacturing equipment and a manufacturing facility. Obviously, a manufacturing facility that's going to be quite huge to produce so many units. But if we have a skimming strategy, then we know, well, yeah, there's some advantages and disadvantages to that strategy, but maybe at that price, we're only going to sell like 3%. And so it gives us a way to test the market, right? There's other ways to implement a test market as part of our research approach, but we get a sense as to the demand, and we could create category need over time. Because even with a penetration pricing strategy, that doesn't mean that we have immediate category need. Does that mean that everybody is still going to see a need for that product? Because remember, part of the diffusion of innovation deals with not just price. It's not just price. Price, we said, is certainly one way for us to impact the diffusion of innovation model, the adoption curve model. But remember, those different segments in the market, the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, those are also lifestyles. So just because you lower the price, that doesn't mean, or you start at a low price, that doesn't mean that people are automatically going to buy MP3 players. There needs to be category need. We need to create that primary demand. So it's complex. This is a very complex situation. Lowering the price or starting at a low price doesn't just solve our problem. We still need to create primary demand. We still need to create category need. So we've got to integrate these approaches and take into account how they're going to influence the demand for the product. Because people may not see a need for MP3 players. Like, what do you mean digital media? I don't get it. What do I need a digital media storage device or digital media player? I don't have any digital media. What am I going to do with this thing? So we need to understand that. What about prestige pricing? So we think about demand-oriented pricing approaches. What is prestige pricing? How does that influence the price that we're going to charge for our product or service? What does that mean? Yeah, Alexei.
Just from the name, I guess, the prestige, I guess, whatever the image it has, if it's like, for example, I don't know, let's take celebrities, often like, they set prestige for the level of certain things like clothing and like cars. So if like the car has like certain, what do you call it, not like physical value, but more of like idea, like a value of being just popular, and yeah, conceptual value, then that's what the price. And then more value is, then higher price you can set. I guess it's also kind of like skimming, if you think about it.
So it's intangible. There's some intangible aspects of what we're selling.
It's something that's above the market price, meaning that if you have a Rolex, you're not going to put it in the same category as other watches based on price. So normal watches that are business watches, but you're above, like you're a business watch, but you're above that of those. You want to place your brand above that as a prestigious brand. So if every watch at that is $1,000 to $5,000, so you place your brand as though you're the $15,000 watch, the $20,000 watch.
So that's part of it. Ari, you want to add something to that?
Just to give an example of the Rolls Royce, when you're not really paying as much for how the car functions, which is similar to most other cars. It's more, right, it's how it's how other people perceive it, how you perceive it. That's what most of the money is going for.
So there's, based on the price, there's an expectation. There's an expectation of quality, the performance quality, and that's going to impact the perceived quality. So what is it? What is the implication there in terms of how we price our products? So what does it mean then when we talk about prestige pricing? Go ahead, Jason.
Setting a high price to make your customer believe that it's so great that it's worth the money.
Yeah, so that you're going to charge more relative to what competitors are charging for a product that has comparable functionality. Like Jacob is talking about watches. Well, don't all watches basically serve the same purpose? Yeah, they all tell time. Some watches are $1, right? Some watches are $1,000. Some watches are $50,000. But the basic functionality is the same. But if it's a Rolex, then the product is going to be priced accordingly, because the price is what's going to help us create an element of prestige. So very often, for example, like for Father's Day, retailers are sensitive to this. And so for Father's Day, you think, oh, they're going to sell let's say like he's talking about clothing. You think, oh, they're going to sell clothing very cheaply, like sweaters and ties. We're going to buy your father a sweater for $10. But they understand this idea of prestige pricing. And so what they do is, instead of selling sweaters for $10, they very often, what some retailers will do, is they'll try to sell sweaters for $50. Why is that? Based on what we just discussed. Why is that an example of prestige pricing?
Because
Yeah.
at this point, sweaters gain much more prestige because
Yeah,
that's what you would give your father, for example.
right, so the perceived value is going to be higher. So that you want to buy your father a nice gift for Father's Day. So $10, you might say, why wouldn't they buy the sweater for $10? You think at $10 you're going to sell a lot of sweaters for Father's Day.
But no.
And maybe for those who have very low income, maybe that's all they could afford. Maybe some will. But very often what will happen is people feel, well, yeah, but I don't want it. That's too cheap. $10. You want to get your father something nicer. And so maybe even the sweater that used to sell for $10, maybe now they just charge $50. And it's going to become more desirable because of that. So if you came in there and they had the price, they had a sign that said $10, you wouldn't buy it. But if it was the same sweater and it said $50, you might buy it. Because of this element of prestige. Because, like we were saying, the price helps deliver this intangible, conceptual element, which is prestige. So if it's at a higher price, like Jason is saying, then the perception, the perceived value is higher, the perceived quality, level of quality is also higher.
One question. Isn't it up to us also sort of to like make the prestige sort of? Like, should we think about it maybe before putting the price? Like,
Well, as marketers, absolutely. So we have to determine what associations are we going to make with our brand and our product to deliver prestige. So how do we position ourselves as a high-end, luxury, prestigious product in a given category? Well, part of that is impacted by price.
right, but also like if we can have a commercial of like I don't know, some Bill Gates or somebody with this kind of clothing or watches or car, whatever we're trying to sell, we would increase the right away.
Oh, so absolutely. So there's other ways. I'm just saying that right now, today, we're focusing on price.
Okay.
I'm saying that, sure, that there's other ways that we could create these strong, unique, and favorable brand associations to establish ourselves as prestigious, as luxurious.
But that's what Apple did kind of also.
With which product?
Apple.
Which product?
Like in general, it seems like they also put themselves as a very prestigious company.
And so what is it that's helped them do that, besides price? Because certainly their products are not inexpensive. Like MacBook Pros are over $2,000. Well, you could buy a netbook for $200. Now, I'm not saying it has the same features and benefits, but there's alternatives, right? There's substitute products. If you want desktop word processing, etc. So absolutely, price is definitely a factor. But what else? What else has enabled them to achieve that positioning if you're saying that it is prestigious, it is high quality?
Design and
The innovation.
innovation, continuous innovation.
Yeah, the innovation. So that supports the price point, and that's what enables them to use, if you will, in some cases, maybe this prestige pricing strategy, although very often they've used for their products a skimming strategy. But the element of prestige, in terms of how they create that in the marketplace, is in large part driven by their innovation. If it wasn't for the high level of innovation, so in other words, the newness of their products, the research that they do, then they wouldn't be able to charge those prices in the marketplace.
But also,
Because their products are state of the art.
right, but it's just like the state of the art in terms of also the way they design and the way they made it. Like that, most you can always like tell which computer is a Mac. You know, you can never confuse it with anything. They like making themselves like they add their brand personality like a little bit because they're like so deep, like a whole race of computers. You know, you could say like in certain sense.
Well, the brand is, we said, what makes one product unique from another. So all the watches tell time, and basically all laptops provide the same basic functionality. Doesn't mean that some don't have more advanced features, but they have the same basic function. But what makes them unique is the brand. They're wrapped in a different brand. So I want to switch gears and talk about, because we talked about a few examples of demand-oriented approaches, and I want to talk about cost-oriented approaches. So what's the difference? Why do we classify these approaches that way? Because we talked about skimming, penetration pricing, prestige pricing. Those are demand-oriented approaches to pricing. And cost-oriented approaches are, for example, cost-plus pricing. So what's the difference? Why do we make a distinction between cost-plus pricing and penetration pricing? Why do we classify those as different? What do you think? How is the focus different? Go ahead, Aaron.
Product based on how much it costs you, as opposed to trying to find out revenues.
Yeah, so when we talk about cost-oriented, that means that we're going to determine the price based on our cost. Versus when we talk about demand-oriented, of course we need to look at our cost, we need to know what it costs us, but we're focused more on what the demand will be at a particular price. And that's going to determine whether or not we're going to have a penetration pricing strategy where we introduce the product at $39 and try and sell 250 million units, or we're going to introduce the product at $1,100. So cost plus pricing, for example, is very common in retail pharmacy. So it could be, cost plus pricing could be a fixed dollar amount. So for example, in retail pharmacy, let me share with you how they implement cost plus pricing. So the store purchases the medication at a certain price. So let's say they purchase the allergy medication, a month's supply of the allergy medication, for $150. And then what they do is they add a fixed amount to that to determine the price. So if they purchase it for $150, so if they got it wholesale at $150, then an example of cost plus pricing, which is where most pharmacies, this is an industry norm, so this is the insight I'm giving you about retail pharmacies based on my experience, usually will add $5, $10, sometimes $15 to the cost of the medication. So if it costs them $150 for that month's supply of medication, then they'll sell it to you, us, the customer, for $155. Some charge more, right? $5 is what some charge. some are able to charge $10, some are able to charge $15, add $15 to their cost. And we said in some cases, they might have a different strategy, which is a strategy, a pricing strategy based on social responsibility, where they might sell the medication at a very low price. So it's not their pricing is not based on profits. It's something else. It's not always about profit. Sometimes it's about doing the right thing, about helping people that are in need. Yeah, Isaac.
Is that just like a markup rate? Like each item, they'll mark up
Well,
percentage?
so that's what we call standard markup, is another cost-oriented approach, which is different from cost plus. So standard markup is a percentage we charge. Our price is based on a percentage, a markup percentage of our cost. So standard markup, an example would be, if we buy, let's say we purchase the product as a retailer, we purchase the product at, let's say, $10. And we have a 50% standard markup. So the markup is based on cost. That means that we would sell the product for $14.99. So depending on the cost, the amount of the markup is going to vary. So if we purchased a product as a retailer for $100 and we still had a 50% standard markup, then we would sell the product at retail for $149 instead of $14.99. So those are different cost-oriented approaches. One is standard markup, a percentage of cost, and cost plus pricing. You see the difference? So who could tell us what cost plus pricing is, based on what we just discussed? Yeah, I just
Just adding a fixed amount to the item as opposed to a percentage based on the cost.
Yeah, so adding a fixed amount to your cost, which an excellent example really is retail pharmaceutical sales. Now, very often, they have a cost plus pricing for their prescription medications, and for their non-prescription medication and non-prescription products, they have a standard markup. So over-the-counter medication or orange juice or shampoo, that's usually standard markup. But it's very common in retail pharmacies to use cost-plus pricing for prescriptions.
Okay. How do both of these play out when a manufacturer wants to sell a product for a certain price in like a bunch of stores? So like if there's a set price that, like, let's say for the game systems we're using, so let's say for the Xbox, if they say it should be sold at $400, and so how do both these things work? Like how does that work for standard markup and cost plus pricing in terms of that?
So as a manufacturer, then we need to understand what are the margin requirements. There's margin requirements for any category. In some cases, it's 10%. In some cases, it's 30%. Sometimes it's 50%. In some cases, it's 100%. So we need to price the product at a level where the retailer, for example, can purchase the product at that price and then be able to achieve the standard markup. Now, manufacturers have an MSRP price, which is the manufacturer's suggested retail price, which I think is what you're alluding to, is that we think that you should sell it at $500. Or we think you should sell it at $50. Whatever it is, whatever the price is, the manufacturer makes a suggestion, and manufacturers will also have what's called MAP pricing. MAP pricing is minimum advertised price. So if you have a product that's very popular, what's going to happen is very often retailers want to promote that product to generate a significant amount of foot traffic in their store, which is another pricing strategy known as loss leader pricing. Loss leader means that you're selling the product in some cases below your cost, less than what you even purchase it for as a retailer. Why? Because you know that that's going to get people in the store. So if you're able to do that with the iPad, for example, or the iPhone, products that, or the iPod, which has been very successful, there's a very high demand for them. So if you're going to sell it at a significant discount, or even below your cost, that's an example of, and we talk about this also in this chapter, of loss leader pricing.
Is that not allowed? Like let's say, if we know an iPad's set at $500, let's say, for a certain memory.
And so if the retailer does that, then the manufacturer has a choice, which the penalty is they'll stop shipping your product.
Oh, like they tell you can't do that?
Right, well that's what MAP pricing is. MAP pricing says you can't advertise the product for less than this amount. And if you do, then we're just not going to ship you any product. So if they run an ad, if some company runs an ad for $300, and we said the MSRP is $500, and we run an ad for $299, that's it. They say we're not going to ship you any product.
So that's why they bundle it with like accessories, let's say, or gift cards or something, because they can't do that.
Right, so that's an approach that some companies do. Some companies even put the MSRP on the product, or on the packaging rather, as a way to try and enforce, if you will, or to try and achieve that suggested retail price. So in other words, you couldn't charge more. That's another problem, is that they might charge more than the suggested retail price, which is what I was suggesting with the Xbox 360. Now, you might want it so bad that you like, I know, it's only what it, somebody said, I think somebody says, oh, that's usually only like $300.
Yeah.
And I said, no, somebody might, they were selling it in the Heights for like $750, and like, what, are you crazy? But they could sell it for whatever they want, right? They might do that. And remember, it's not Microsoft, that's not Microsoft's pricing strategy. That's the retailer's pricing strategy. So we've got to remember that when we talk about pricing and we look at the value chain, there's different players in the value chain. There's different organizations, and we need to, when we think about pricing, we have to determine, well, oh, wait a minute, are we talking about the manufacturer's pricing strategy, or are we talking about the retailer's pricing strategy? Those are different situations.
What's the point of that, to sell it for $750? Like how would you make a sale for $750 and something could go up for $400?
Because of scarcity, which means that there's no product available. That very often for products like that are very popular, when they first come out,
Like when it sells out right away or something?
yeah, it sells out right away, and so somehow you were able to get 100 of them, or maybe even only 10. So you're the only guy in New York City that has 10 Xbox 360. You can charge whatever you want. Maybe you get somebody to pay $1,000. But remember, that's different from saying Microsoft introduced the Xbox 360 at $1,000. The implications are very different. No, we're not saying that. We're saying that a retailer charged more than the manufacturer's suggested retail price. And that's one of the things that we talk about in this chapter is, besides the demand-oriented, penetration pricing, skimming, what else did we say? prestige pricing, and there's others. There's also cost-oriented pricing strategies. We talked about cost plus, standard markup, and then there's also
Net pricing.
yep, there's map pricing, which is the manufacturer's attempt to maintain a certain perceived value in the marketplace, a certain minimum perceived price or value for their particular product. Because they're concerned that once it's promoted at $2.99, that people won't be willing to buy it for $500 anymore. That's the challenge with promotions. That's the problem with selling orange juice 2 for $5. Is after that, then people don't want to buy orange juice for $3.99 anymore for half a gallon. Because to them, we've now reduced the perceived value from $3.99 to $2.50. So that's why I said when we talk about penetration pricing, I mean, how do you start off at a low price and then raise the price? Or once you lower the price, then it's very difficult to then one week you tell them it's $2.50 and then next week you say it's $3.99. And you say, but it was on sale. That was a TPR, temporary price reduction. But, you know, explain that. We're thinking about it in rational terms. But are customers rational? Are their behaviors rational? Very often it's not rational, it's emotional. They say, well, last week I paid $2.50, this week it's $3.99. Something just not right about that. So it's a challenge. And so we talked about also competition-oriented approaches, which is the loss leader pricing strategies. And then also we talked about the idea of selling above the market price. So loss leader is you sell below the market price, and then there's situations where you might actually sell above. So those are other examples. And then sometimes we have profit-oriented approaches. So in other words, we have a certain amount of margin that we want to make, or a certain return on an investment. So we look at the gross margin or the return on sales for a particular product. So that's going to influence the price that we charge. So it's not the number of units, it's that's our pricing objective, but sometimes it's not based on demand, it's not based on cost, it's not based on competition, it's based on a target that we set for profit. So our senior management tells us that we need to have 50% gross margin. But maybe that means that at that level of profit that we're going to sell less units. And you know what they might say? Because some retailers, in my experience, I worked with a variety of different retailers and selling, right, working with clients to sell in their products. And some of them say, you know, we realize that at a lower price, we'll sell 50,000 units per week. But that means we'll have to accept only 20% margin. 20% margin, 50,000 units. 50% margin, 20,000 units. Now, you guys we could all decide for ourselves what we think is better, but what I'm telling you is that at some retailers, for example, they say, you know what, you might think we're crazy. We'd rather sell 20,000 units and make 50% margin than sell 50,000 units and make 20% margin. So sometimes the pricing strategy is based on a certain level of profit that we want to achieve. So a certain percentage. Now, how would we counter that? If we're trying to sell into their store, how would we counter that and try and encourage them to take only a 20% markup on the product instead of 50%? How would we get them to sell the product at, instead of $149, let's say $119? What would be our logic? What would be our rationale?
More people would buy it, so they'd have more of a customer base, a higher share of the market.
So they possibly, they'd sell more units, more foot traffic in their store, and also
It's sell more units as opposed to selling $250 ones or $320 ones to make more money.
But sometimes, for example, retailers, their objective is not to maximize the number of units. That's what I'm sharing with you in terms of pricing approaches. Sometimes the pricing approach is focused on profit. And they're willing to say, I'd rather sell 20,000 units instead of 50,000 units and be more profitable. But that's just looking at the margin percent. We got 3 more hours, right? That's just looking at the margin percent. But what we would argue, what we would suggest is that, yes, you would be at 50% margin. But what we would argue is, but your total profit, because if you're selling 50,000 units instead of 20,000 units, that your total profit would be more. That you can't take percentages to the bank, only dollars. So what is it? Who has a calculator? Let's see if I pick some numbers that are appropriate. How much is 50,000 times 150? Somebody, anybody.
50,000 times 150.
Right.
750,000.
Right. And then, so 20,000,
7.5 million.
20,000 times 120.
2.4 million.
2.4 million. And how much was the other?
7.5.
7.5? 7.5 million versus 2.4 million? Is that what you got?
Yeah.
Both you guys?
Yeah.
So the difference in sales, is very substantial. But now let's look at how much we make per unit. The unit contribution margin in the first example, 20,000 units, is $20 per unit. So $20 per unit times 20,000 units, no, times 50,000 units, right, is $1 million. And what about at $50 per unit times 20,000 units? You guys can't do the math in your head? It's also $1 million, right? So what does that tell us? That tells us, based on our assumptions, right? Because they might say, well, how do I know it's going to be 50,000? So, but what we're saying is that the amount of profit, the number of units is less, but the total amount of profit is the same in this case. The total amount of profit is $1 million. So whether we sell 20,000 units at $150 or 50,000 units at $120, we would argue you're still making $1 million. Your profit, your gross margin on that product at retail is still $1 million.
So it depends how you want to make it.
And so that's certainly part of our case in terms of selling it at a lower price and taking less margin. Certainly, we would want to present it in a way that's even more compelling by showing that the total amount of profit would even be more than $1 million. So this is just based on our assumptions, which they might challenge. They might say, well, when you said it would be 50,000 units, we think at that price it would only be 30,000 units. All right, so good job. See you guys next time.
Thank you.
Orange juice!